There's a specific kind of dread that shows up 2 days after payday, when the number that felt so solid on Friday afternoon already looks smaller by Sunday night. And you can't point to a single purchase that explains where it went. Nothing dramatic happened. No emergency, no splurge, no obvious mistake. Just a slow, invisible leak. The same one that happens every single pay cycle. And somehow, it always feels like a surprise, even though it's never actually surprising. Most people assume the answer is a budget. Track every dollar, categorize every expense, and the leak will seal itself. Except budgets fail constantly. Not because people are lazy, but because a budget tries to fight a feeling using math. And feelings don't respond to spreadsheets. What actually changes a financial life isn't a system of restriction. It's a small number of rules, quiet enough to barely notice, that remove the moment of decision entirely. Because the moment of decision is where almost everyone loses. Here's the first one, and it sounds too simple to matter. Never let a purchase happen the same hour the desire for it shows up. Not a full budget category, not a lecture about discipline, just a delay. 24 hours between wanting something and buying it. This works because of something called present bias, which is the brain's tendency to weigh right now feelings far more heavily than future consequences, even when the future consequence is obviously bigger. A $140 jacket seen at 9 p.m. after a long day doesn't feel like $140. It feels like relief from the day itself, purchased and shipped. But the same jacket, revisited the next morning with a clear head, usually just looks like a jacket. The desire doesn't survive contact with time. Almost nothing does. This single rule, applied consistently, quietly removes hundreds of dollars a month in purchases that were never really about the item at all. Picture someone getting home from a brutal shift, the kind where every decision all day was made for someone else. They open a delivery app before they've even taken their shoes off. It's not hunger driving that motion. It's exhaustion looking for the fastest possible relief. And $22 for dinner feels like a small price for 5 minutes of not having to decide anything else. Do that 3 nights a week, and it's roughly $280 a month, quietly bleeding out of an account that was supposed to be building towards something. Nobody chose to abandon their savings goal. They just kept trading it, one exhausted decision at a time, for small doses of immediate relief. That's the first rule, solving a problem most people never diagnosed correctly. They thought they had a food problem. They actually had an unprocessed emotion problem. And delivery apps were simply the closest tool available to numb it. The second rule is harder to hear, because it usually arrives right after good news. Someone gets a raise, an extra $500 a month after taxes. And for the first 2 weeks, it feels like winning. Then, almost without a decision being made, the car payment quietly increases because a nicer trim now feels reasonable. A subscription gets added. Lunches shift from packed to ordered, just because there's a little more room now. 90 days later, the extra $500 is completely gone, absorbed into a marginally nicer version of the same exact life. And the strange part is the person doesn't feel any richer than they did before the raise. This is hedonic adaptation, and it might be the single most expensive psychological pattern that exists, because it's invisible while it's happening. The brain doesn't register income levels. It registers change, adjusts to the new baseline almost instantly, and then treats that baseline as the new minimum required just to feel normal. The second rule exists specifically to interrupt this. The moment income increases, before it ever touches a checking account, a fixed percentage gets redirected somewhere untouchable. Not, I'll save what's left over, because there's never anything left over. Not because of a lack of income, but because lifestyle always expands to consume whatever's available, unless something physically blocks it first. If that same $500 raise had been automated into an index fund, instead of absorbed into a nicer trim level, at a historical 7% average annual return, it would grow into roughly $8,600 within a year and 3 months. Not because $500 is some magic figure, but because that's usually the first amount that stops feeling symbolic and starts feeling like an actual buffer. A car repair stops being a 5-alarm emergency, and a slow month at work stops being terrifying. Remember that moment from the very beginning? The Sunday night dread of watching a paycheck shrink for no visible reason? Here's the layer underneath it that wasn't obvious yet. That dread was never really about the money disappearing. It was about a complete absence of control over where it went. Every one of these rules exists to hand a small piece of that control back, not through restriction, but through removing the decision before the feeling ever gets a vote. There's a couple sitting across from each other at a kitchen table, a laptop open between them, a shared statement pulled up. One of them points to a $410 charge from a store the other doesn't remember agreeing to. It wasn't reckless. In isolation, it isn't even that large. But it becomes the argument, because money inside a relationship almost never stays about money for long. It becomes a referendum on whether one partner feels controlled, and whether the other feels judged for trying to feel some agency inside a system that constantly makes them feel like they have none. This is mental accounting doing exactly what it always does. The same $410 spent on rent barely registers, while $410 spent impulsively becomes a symbol large enough to end an evening. The third rule is the one that quietly reshapes what enough even means, because it targets anchoring, the brain's habit of judging a number not on its own terms, but against whoever's standing closest. Someone earning $68,000 who spends time around people earning $150,000 doesn't feel like they're doing fine. They feel behind, even though $68,000 outperforms most of the country. The number hasn't changed. The comparison point has. The third rule is simple to state and brutal to actually practice. Measure progress only against your own bank statement from a year ago, never against anyone else's this month. This one rule alone dismantles most of what status signaling depends on, because status signaling only works if you're comparing outward. The moment the comparison turns inward, an entire category of spending, the car upgrade nobody needed, the renovation that wasn't actually necessary, the vacation photo purchased more for an audience than for the memory, starts to lose its psychological grip. It gets worse at higher incomes, not better. And this is the part almost nobody expects walking into this. Lifestyle creep doesn't slow down as income rises. It usually accelerates. Because higher income unlocks bigger status purchases, and those purchases come stapled to recurring costs that quietly outpace the raise that funded them. Someone earning $150,000 leveling up often means a bigger mortgage, a leased SUV, private schooling, a renovated kitchen, 5-figure annual costs arriving all at once, dressed up as reasonable choices for someone at their level. The income tripled, the financial pressure sometimes quadrupled. That's status signaling working exactly as designed, convincing people that spending more is proof they've arrived, at the exact moment it quietly locks them into needing that income level forever, not to fund a life, but to maintain an identity. Here's a contrast worth sitting with for a second. Income is what shows up. Freedom is what's left over once everything else has been paid, protected, and automated out of reach of impulse. Two people can earn the exact same salary and live in completely different emotional worlds, because one of them built freedom quietly underneath the income, while the other is spending it as fast as it lands, mistaking comfort for control. Comfort feels good in a specific moment it's purchased. Control feels good every single day afterward, in the background, whether anyone's paying attention to it or not. The fourth rule addresses the actual reason most financial advice fails on contact with real life. Willpower is a finite resource, and it runs out faster than anyone expects. By the time someone's made 40 small decisions before lunch, the tank is already low, and every financial choice made in the afternoon is being made by a more tired, more impulsive version of the same person who set the New Year's resolution back in January. The fourth rule doesn't ask for more willpower. It removes the need for willpower entirely by automating every meaningful financial decision the moment income arrives. Savings, investing, even a small guilt-free spending allowance, so that by the time exhaustion sets in at 8 p.m., there's nothing left to decide, because it was already decided weeks ago by a calmer, more rested version of the same brain. This is where the math starts to compound into something worth pausing on. Picture someone who made this decision 3 years ago, automating $400 a month into an index fund before it ever touched a checking account. They don't check it obsessively. They don't panic during a downturn because they never intended to touch it during a downturn in the first place. At a 7% average annual return, $400 a month becomes roughly $10,000 within about a year and 8 months. Extend that same quiet habit to 8 years, and it crosses $50,000. Stretch it to 22 years, and it's sitting past $250,000. At 30 years, that same modest $400 monthly habit crosses $450,000, and nudging the contribution up to $700 a month over that same 30-year window pushes the total well past $750,000, brushing right up against 7 figures once a few strong market years are factored in. None of these numbers required a 6-figure salary. They required a decision made once, automated permanently, and then simply left alone. This is the quiet difference between spending and investing that almost nobody feels in real time. Spending resolves a feeling today and leaves nothing behind by tomorrow. Investing ignores the feeling today entirely and leaves something behind that compounds in total silence for years, unnoticed, until one day it isn't small anymore. The $22 delivery order and the $22 automatic transfer feel almost identical in the exact moment they leave an account. Only one of them is still working for you a decade later, and that difference is the entire distance between staying stuck and getting free. There's a version of hyperbolic discounting hiding inside almost every stalled savings goal. The brain's tendency to treat a guaranteed $5,000 today as more real than a projected $50,000 15 years out, even when the math says the future number matters infinitely more. The brain isn't built to feel the future. It's built to feel right now, and right now almost always wins, unless a system has already made the choice before the feeling gets a chance to argue. That's the entire purpose behind rules 1 through 4. Not more discipline, but fewer moments where discipline is even required. Which leads to the 5th rule, the one that actually determines what all this money was ever for. Most people chase money to buy things. The 5th rule reframes the entire goal. Money's real function is buying back time and attention, not objects. A $1 million portfolio at a conservative 4% withdrawal rate generates roughly $40,000 a year, indefinitely, without touching the underlying balance. Enough, for many people, to fund an entire life without ever trading another hour for a paycheck again. That's not a fantasy number reserved for the ultra-wealthy. It's the mathematical result of the first 4 rules, run quietly and consistently over 15 or 20 years, with nothing more dramatic than automation, patience, and a refusal to compare a bank statement to anyone else's. Go back to the very beginning, that Sunday night dread, watching a number shrink for no visible reason, certain that something was being lost even though nothing obvious had happened. That feeling was never really about the dollars leaving the account. It was about the complete absence of a system standing between impulse and outcome. Once that becomes visible, these 5 rules stop looking like financial advice and start looking like what they actually are: a way of building enough quiet underneath the noise of everyday spending that the nervous system finally gets permission to exhale. None of these rules requires more money to start. They require a decision made once, on a calm day,